My name is David Leonard. I'm a researcher and lecturer at Vielen University, which is sitting up on top of Carneberg. If you're not from Vienna, if you look around and see a building on top of a big hill, that's probably my workplace. My story is that I became vegetarian about 3 years ago for no real reason. Maybe some vague, undefined environmental concern, but I really can't say that I really had a proper reason, other than my girlfriend at the time was also vegetarian. What I found was that immediately after that, I started reading about animal rights. And I instantly accepted what I now consider to be self-evident truths. And within about 2 weeks, I was vegan. As part of the life-changing transformation that this is, I changed my PhD research to look at not why I turned vegan, but how I'd managed to resist or avoid these lessons for so many years. So the research I'm going to present is from my dissertation, which I'm going to be defending towards the end of this year. So very broadly, we know that veganism is, as opposed to just plant-based nutrition, is motivated by ethical considerations. Given this, activists ideally would like to present their arguments as a social justice issue. But even though the ethical case for veganism is very strong, what we tend to find is that ethics-based communication has only been marginally effective. And one of the biggest issues here is that many people see the issue of animal rights as categorically unimportant, simply not worth considering. And Melanie Joy's work on carnism helps to explain this as a type of cultural conditioning that means that we don't even consider the issue as being worthy of consideration. So it can be a challenge to even engage people into advocacy dialogues. We know this. Unfortunately, I don't have any tips for you on how to help people to engage in the first place in advocacy dialogues. But what I've focused on instead is how audiences react once they engage in the topic. And what we tend to find is that audiences are often unreceptive. They might look for using defensive strategies and justifications, as opposed to really engaging properly in the topic. So my question is, why is this? What we find is that meat eaters experience a range of various negative emotions. They show quite a lot of ambivalence towards their own meat-eating practices. This happens when certain other thoughts are brought to their attention. Now, various authors have termed this the meat paradox. The fact that they say these emotions arise from the meat paradox. This is the idea that we enjoy eating meat, but we're somehow uncomfortable about the imposition that our dietary behaviours place on the animals affected. So this is the meat paradox. Michael Pollan would call it the omnivore's dilemma. Other authors have looked at this and said, well, these inconsistencies are likely to arise cognitive dissonance in meat eaters. Various authors sort of speculated on this using anecdotal evidence, and a bunch of others have actually sought to support this theory in experimental settings. So, what is cognitive dissonance? Well, very broadly, cognitive dissonance is a state of discomfort which arises as a result of some inconsistency between our beliefs, values, or behaviours, and which we're motivated to avoid or resolve. So, yeah, a whole bunch of authors have empirically demonstrated that cognitive dissonance is likely to arise in meat eaters when their attention is somehow drawn to the living being from which their meal came. Typically, what they find is that individuals seek to alleviate their dissonance by changing the way that they perceive the animal. They might attribute it, for instance, lesser cognitive abilities or a lesser ability to feel. And as a result of this, they lower the moral value that they ascribe to the animal. So these studies have established the existence of latent inconsistencies within individuals which do have the potential to arouse dissonant states in certain conditions. What we don't understand yet is what the exact mechanism is through which this dissonance is aroused. As you'll see, this question is of importance to vegan advocates. Other authors have documented the various defensive strategies and justifications that people use to resolve their dissonance in authentic situations, or better yet, to avoid the arousal of dissonance altogether. For example, the classification of different species into edible or inedible groups, which is this core component of the Kana schema described by Melanie Joy. This is what Rothschild would describe as a dichotomization strategy, separating into groups. Many of these processes function sort of below the level of conscious awareness. So they act to preclude the arousal of dissonance in the first place. Most individuals in my study don't make a mental connection between the animals they consume, between the meat they consume and the living being from which it came. Rothschild would refer to this as a process of dissociation. It's hardly surprising that if people never even consider the victim that they're about to consume, it's hardly surprising that they're not motivated to act on behalf of the victim, who Carol Adams would refer to as the absent referent. So, on the other hand, when individuals are confronted, that sounds a bit aggressive, let's say when individuals are exposed to vegan advocacy, they're likely to, the conditions which are likely to induce cognitive dissonance are pretty hard to avoid. Regardless of whether the message is animal-based or environment-based or health-based, the audiences are likely to have revealed to them some kind of internal inconsistency in the various beliefs that they hold. So how is cognitive dissonance relevant to vegan advocacy? The first thing to mention is that dissonance is a motivated state. This is a good thing. This provides a motivation to change. If our audience didn't experience dissonance, then they would have no impetus to actually change their behaviors, which is what we want of them. So we shouldn't think of cognitive dissonance as a bad thing. The real question is how the dissonance is going to be resolved. We have this conflict, how is it going to be resolved? What we typically see is that people either ignore or eliminate certain cognitions. By cognitions, we're talking about anything you can think about. You can think about your attitudes, your values, your beliefs. You can think about the behaviors that you performed last Thursday. So this idea of cognition is a good way to incorporate everything that we can think about. So what we see is, they might ignore certain cognitions, they add certain cognitions, or they weight them. They change the relative importance they ascribe to them. All these represent attitude change, and of course, people could also change their behaviors, which is ultimately what we're seeking. What we tend to see is that the usual outcome is that people will change the thing which is easiest to change. What we see is that this tends to be privately held thoughts are easier for people to change than their behaviors, particularly when these are publicly known behaviors which have been witnessed by others. So another thing that we need to do when we resolve our inconsistency is to actually resolve the inconsistency. So in order to know how people are going to do this, we need to know what exactly is this inconsistency within meat eaters which is arousing these dissonant states. So despite surviving in the literature for 70 years now, cognitive dissonance is a really well accepted psychological phenomenon, but there are a range of different models which have been proposed to explain how dissonance arises. And the essential difference between these is that they refer to a different nature of the inconsistency. So these are 6 of the best recognized competing strategies of this time. In the literature, they tend to be examined just one at a time, and in previous studies, at most, they've been compared 2 at a time, but this is the first study that I am aware of which seeks to examine the applicability of all of them in a unified setting. So, Yeah, so as such, we really don't know which of the competing models truly explains the process of cognitive dissonance, or whether the process might be different for different people or in different settings. As Hank Rothschild highlighted in 2014, there are almost any of these models could actually be the one which applies in the case of meat eaters, as there are all kinds of different inconsistencies which are applicable to these models. I set out to establish exactly which of these models is at play. And this information is potentially valuable to activists because various of the different models propose specific interventions which can be employed to moderate the level of dissonance that audiences feel, and to influence the way in which their dissonance is resolved in the end. So, what did I do? I conducted an experiment, which we're going to get to very soon. But as part of this, I needed to measure people's attitudes towards the use of animals for food. And I believed that people hold inconsistent attitudes. So if I was simply to ask simple questions like, is it okay to eat meat? I might get a yes from many people. If I ask them, is it wrong to kill unnecessarily? I might also get a yes from people. And there's an apparent inconsistency there. So just asking simple questions was not going to be a good way to get a grip on how people see the topic in a holistic sense. So what I used was an approach called Q methodology. The reason I use this is because it enables me to see all these inconsistencies and to contextualize this into a holistic view. So before I started my experiment, I was going to be measuring people's attitudes with this system, but I needed a benchmark in order to, against which I could measure people's attitudes. So I started last year at CARE in Warsaw, where 20 self-proclaimed animal rights activists volunteered to go through this procedure with me and provide me with their attitudes towards the use of animals for food in Europe, which is the overarching question. What did I ask them to do? Well, each of these is a single card with a statement on them. It's a comprehensive set of statements relating to the use of animals for food. It includes various items relating to animal welfare, animal rights, to social issues, to religious concerns, environmental and health aspects. I used academic sources in order to formulate these, as well as YouTube videos and comment sections. So it should be a comprehensive picture of the different considerations that people go through when they're thinking about the use of animals for food in Europe. So the activists were asked to place each of these cards onto this grid according to how much they agree with each statement and how much importance they allocated to it. So it's sort of a ranking exercise where you have to decide, is this more important to me than this? Okay, so that's what I did. The basic analysis technique for Q methodology is factor analysis. And it's designed to identify shared viewpoints between individuals and then to measure the attitudinal proximity of others to these shared viewpoints. So I didn't know what I was going to find. I didn't know if we as a group would have a single coherent view of the topic, or whether I might find differences between rightists and consequentialists, or between religious and non-religious activists, for instance. What did I find? Well, a single shared perspective towards the use of animals for food. That is, 19 out of the 20 activists that participated in this presented me with a very similar distribution to each other. Technically speaking, 19 of the 20 activists loaded primarily onto a single factor. So I won't talk much about this point of view because it's very likely exactly your point of view, or very close to it. To summarize, the capacities and experiences of animals are the most important considerations to this group. Individual hedonic concerns are significantly much less important. To summarize, all of the justifications for eating meat, which we're all familiar with, are soundly rejected by this point of view. So it's really not very surprising. What we see, the overall picture is one which is quite altruistic. There's a lot of thoughts for others and relatively few thoughts for us. When we think about use of animals for food in Europe, we're concerned more about the animals than we are about us. This was the overall picture which emerged. So this didn't really give me any surprises, this outcome. It's interesting to know that we essentially have quite a unified perspective on this topic. I'd also like to thank, especially if there's any here, and I think I recognise one, any participants who helped me out with this last year. I'm very grateful for that. So now I have this complete picture of the activist perspective, like a prototypical view of our perspective on the topic. My assumption then was that it is the goal of vegan advocacy to shift audience attitudes towards this particular point of view. So now I was ready to start with my experiment. I did this at my own university as well as another one, IMC Krems. There was 98 university students in total, undergraduate and master's level students. They're fairly diverse in terms of nationalities, gender, and religion. Their diets were pretty close to national averages. Now, most of these participants, about 80 out of the 98, participated in the context of the research design course in which they were enrolled. So I went in and took over their course, gave a course on experimental designs, and ran my experiment as part of this. That means that the participants are really quite a broad cross-section of university students. They were not people who were initially attracted to the topic. In fact, they didn't even know about the topic until the procedure was well underway. Of course, this sounds like it might pose ethical problems, but the whole protocol was approved by the ethics board of my university. So that's the full list of students. I'm restricted to looking at students. This has some limitations for how much I can generalize my findings, but given that university students are such a core target group for vegan advocacy, I don't see that as too much of a limitation. Yeah. Each of these students was randomly allocated to one of 5 treatment groups. So I had 5 different treatment groups with about 20 people in each. In the control group, these people just went through exactly the same procedure as the vegan advocates. I simply asked them to complete the Q-sort to give me their point of view on the topic. Factor analysis revealed that there was 3 dominant shared viewpoints among this group. The first, which really the majority of participants actually endorsed this viewpoint to quite a high level. And there's some good news. They recognize veganism as a distinct possibility. That is, they see that vegan diets are nutritionally adequate. They see that they can be both tasty and enjoyable. They see that meat consumption is unnecessary, but they see veganism as quite hard work. There's a bit of effort involved. I guess that's quite true. They also accept many of the basic tenets of ethical veganism. They see, they recognize human-animal similarities in terms of consciousness and sentience and the presence or absence of a soul and various other aspects. So things are looking quite good at that stage. However, all of these thoughts regarding animals are relegated to somewhere behind social considerations. That is, they see that it's very important to them that veganism is socially acceptable. It's also important to them that meat eating is socially acceptable, and all these social concerns tended to be right out of the extremes, be the most important things to them. And this is kind of summarized by what turned out to be their most endorsed item in the whole set, which is whether or not to eat meat is a matter of personal choice. So this is the dominant viewpoint. There's some good news there. We have a solid basis to work on here. Some other viewpoints which were present, although they were much less important to this group. Another viewpoint seemed to be shaped largely by religion, and all of the religious people in this group happened to be Christian. The viewpoint generally was quite pro-animal, but it was this attitude was formed on a basis which is different to human-animal similarity. That is, from this religious viewpoint, they don't accept that humans and animals are similar, but nevertheless they hold very positive pro-animal views.
But pro-animal means well treatment of animals, not animal rights, I guess, very strongly in this case.
So in both cases, I would say that they can be both on a continuum, from zero animal rights to full animal rights, from zero animal welfare to full animal welfare. So the point is that they were rather to the right on each of these scales. This raises questions about how we should talk to people who subscribe strongly to this viewpoint. Should we insist on human-animal similarity? This might be a very important element in their worldview. Perhaps it doesn't make sense for us to, pursue this line of reasoning of animal-human similarity and to perhaps destroy their worldview. Maybe there's things that we can do to work within their narrative of the world to direct them as we would like, without going this human-animal similarity approach. The third factor, this was only endorsed by a couple of people. These people have no problem justifying meat consumption because they perceive it as a physiological necessity. This is a very minimal viewpoint. As I said, most of the people see meat as entirely unnecessary. So this essentially summarizes the different viewpoints of the activists, of the students when they're just asked, without any extra information being presented to them. To take this group as a whole, I could now measure how similar the student perspectives were to the activists, and this is done with a correlation. What I found is that the correlation between the activist perspectives and this group of students was 0.2. This is a very low level of correlation. Essentially, the viewpoints are really quite dissimilar.
Sorry?
Yep.
About how was the intergroup correlation in this control group, just for.
So, in Q methodology, you input all this data. So each of these will be numbered, and they're all in a certain column. You input all of this into a. So for each person, you get a distribution which tells you this card is in this column, this card is in this column, etc. And the process of factor analysis in Q methodology, it correlates every person's distribution with every other person's distribution.
And then you have an intergroup correlation.
Right.
And I was asking how, just to know. I would be interested.
Okay, so how similar was the group to itself, yes. In other words?
Yes.
Yeah, so I don't have that.
Okay, just about.
We can check it out later.
Just because you compared the other two groups, I would like to know how similar to themselves was the group actually.
So, in terms of these different factors, Q methodology assumes that there are a range of viewpoints out there, and it considers the people to be the variables in the study. Not the sample, but the variables. We're variables because we can take on one of these existing viewpoints to a certain degree. So what we see is that in the case of the first viewpoint that I explained, most of the people loaded on this viewpoint to about 0.7. This is quite strong, and they loaded on the others to much lesser degrees.
I can tell it later, but if you have the factors, it would be nice to see what kind of correlation it is.
Let's get to it after. every other participant, so the rest of the 80 participants, before I measured their attitudes, I sat them down and exposed them to a 40-minute vegan advocacy message. I standardized this in the case of a video, and I used Bite-Sized Vegans' Extremism of Veganism talk. If you're not familiar with it, Emily introduces welfare and rights issues by reverse engineering both eggs and milk back to the source to highlight the experience of the animals involved. There is a little bit of graphic footage, but it only goes for about a minute and is preceded by a warning. And she spends about the last 15 minutes discussing environmental and health aspects. So it's quite a well-rounded talk. The overall narrative is that is begging the question of whether veganism is really an extreme choice in the context of the extreme things which have to happen for carnism to take place. And she also seeks to empower the audience as well. So this is the first success of my video, of my research, I think. I managed to get 80 people to sit down and watch this video. The question is, how effective was it? So one group just watched the video and then had their attitudes measured. What do you think I found? Did it shift their attitudes towards the activists dramatically? You are right. What we saw, so this is the control group A, who didn't watch the video. Their similarity, on this scale we have increasing similarity with the activists here. So group B, the ones that watched the video, they had attitudes which were slightly closer to those of the activists. How did this happen? Well, a couple of the pro-animal statements were increased in their agreement and their level of importance. Just a couple, typically 3 or 4 cognitions. However, this increase was not deemed to be statistically significant. Part of this is because my sample size is so small, but also because the increase is just not that great. What I'm looking at here is the holistic perspective, seeing if there's a holistic change in their view of the subject. Because the attitude shift was positive, this already speaks against the applicability of one of the cognitive dissonance models. The New Looks model said that people should change their attitude so that their behaviours seem less aversive, less bad. Clearly, if we're increasing our the importance of animals, this is not going to solve this dilemma. So this speaks against the applicability of that model. Okay. All of the other treatment groups, they also watched the video, but prior to that, there was another manipulation. These manipulations were derived from the various cognitive dissonance models. So in group E, these participants were successfully primed to use personal standards in deciding what's right and wrong, rather than normative standards, which the literature shows we tend to employ by default. We look at what's accepted by society and we accept that as right and wrong, applying these normative standards, rather than sitting down and really nutting out an ethical case and deciding what we think personally. So these people were encouraged to employ personal standards. What result did this have? Well, if the self-standards model was true, but because people are applying the self-standards rather than normative standards, this should influence the degree of dissonance that is aroused, and therefore it should change the way that they resolve this dissonance. What I found was, again, very similar to the group that just watched the video. There was an increase in the importance of certain animal cognitions, but this did not amount to a holistic change in perspective. Essentially, these non-significant findings say that I can't claim that there was actually an increase in this group. I can't claim that because I can't eliminate the possibility that I got these results just by chance. This is the idea of statistical significance.
Could you please explain again how they were manipulated? Because I didn't get it.
So in this group, they were asked to consider a time. They were asked to consider something that society accepts that they don't accept, or vice versa. Something that they don't accept that society accepts, and they should think about how it can be that they differ from what society thinks. I then ran a manipulation check, which asked them on a scale from my views are never aligned with those of society to my views are always aligned with society. And what I found was that this group was closer to never aligned with society than any of the other groups. This is my check that the manipulation worked. However, this inducing people to use self-standards didn't make a difference to the persuasive impact of the video. This speaks against the self-standards model. In treatment group D, the manipulation was a self-affirmation exercise designed to raise people's self-esteem. And again, the manipulation check showed that this was successful. The self-affirmation and self-consistency models are all about people's self-image. They say that dissonance is aroused when our sense of self-image is threatened. So if these two models actually explain the process of cognitive dissonance in meat eaters, increasing their self-esteem should influence the degree of dissonance that they feel. What I found was, again, just the same as the past groups. There was an increase in similarity to the activists, but this was, again, non-significant. So this, again, speaks against the applicability of these two models.
Sorry, as someone who's in no way, shape, or form a mathematician, how big is this scale? Like 0.5?
So correlations run from -1 to 1.
Okay.
-1 is a perfectly inverse relationship, and 1 is a perfectly perfect positive relationship. So if we had the answer, a figure of 1 would say these people have exactly the same point of view as the prototypical activist view. In the final treatment group, here I used an induced compliance manipulation. That is, I gave each of these participants a small card which had this phrase on it. Would you prefer to live in a country with rather stricter or rather looser animal welfare laws, and why? I gave them a minute to think about it, and then I asked them to respond just to me verbally. All of these 20 participants opted for rather stronger, rather stricter animal welfare laws. This is what I would expect, and they were considered to have complied with this manipulation. I would have also expected all of the other participants to give the same answers as well. But what's different in this group is that they had to take this privately held belief that animal welfare is a good thing, and they were induced to translate that into a behavior, as in they verbalized it. And so this is the essential difference between Group C participants and all the other participants. Not that they hold a belief in animal welfare, but they have formulated it as a behavior. What I found was that this time many more pro-animal conditions increased, and this gave an overall shift in their holistic perspective, which was significantly closer to the activists. So only in this group am I able to say conclusively that the holistic perspective of these people actually shifted towards the perspective of the activists. This seems to give empirical support for both of these different models. So what are these models about? Well, they're based on the idea of consistency. We know that the conventional model says that people have an innate drive for consistency just because they do. It was because this original description was so vague that most of these other cognitive dissonance models came about. People tried to explain why. Why do we have this innate drive? The most recent model, the active the action-based model says that this is in order to facilitate effective action. Essentially, this is an evolutionary adaptation, because if we're holding conflicting conditions, we're indecisive. We're not able to act effectively, and therefore we have a drive for holding, for holding clear thoughts which are unconflicted. So consistency is key to both of these models. What that really suggests is that we ought to load up the vegan position with as many different elements as possible. We ought to use every argument that's available to us, because it seems that unlike the other models which suggest that sense of identity and these different aspects are important, these two models suggest that nothing's important other than the ultimate weight which is on each side of the balance. So this seems to be an environment for using every argument that we have, and this is not a comprehensive list, of course, in order to stack the balance. The sheer weight of the cognition should determine the outcome, how people resolve this. But what we've also shown is that not all cognitions carry the same weight. Our habits, we actually recall these as behaviors. And behaviors are shown in the experiment to apply much more weight to this reasoning, to this weighing of the two sides. So what can we do here? Well, one thing that we can do is do what I did in the experiment, and get people to transfer these beliefs that they hold, get them to translate these into behaviors. This suggests that personal advocacy ought to be run as a dialogue rather than a monologue, and we ought to get as many concessions from people as we can, even if they're really, really small things. But the act of getting people to verbalize their pro-animal beliefs can have a profound impact on their ultimate attitudes. The idea is that we don't carry around well-articulated attitudes on all subjects, or even very many subjects, and we don't know our attitude until we're actually forced to formulate it on the spot. And when we're in that situation, we do an information search for anything that might be relevant, and one of the things that we do is we reflect on our prior behaviors to find out, I'm the kind of person that acts that way, and this causes our future behaviors also to follow suit. So this is one implication, that in personal advocacy, we ought to get people to translate their pro-animal cognitions into behaviors. But it also asks broader questions about our strategies. If behaviors seem to be so influential in formulating our attitudes, rather than just the other way around, it also suggests that any initiatives designed to influence people's behaviors, veganuary or whatever it happens to be, any ways that we seek to influence people's behaviors, even without attitude change, it seems that this is likely to cause attitude change later on. In our quest for a world which is vegan for the animals, the for the animals bit can come after the vegan bit, is what this research suggests. So that's the extent of the experiment, but I have some other findings which are quite interesting. Here we look at differences between the two genders. So what do we see here? Again, we have the correlation with the activists up the scale here. These are the people from the control group, Group A, that didn't watch the video. And what we see is that females had attitudes closer to the activists than the males. However, the difference was not so great between them. Over here we have all of the 4 groups who were exposed to the video. And what we see is that the effect of watching the video was strongly persuasive on the female audience members and only very marginally persuasive on the male audience members. I do have some reflections on why this might be if we have time to get to them. But this is quite familiar with, I'm sure, a lot of people's experience that females are often more receptive than males are to the messages we present. One extreme case, this pattern held across each of these different groups, but one extreme case was just the people who didn't watch the video with the people who only watched the video. There, as we see, the effect on females was strongly persuasive. Male attitudes actually moved away from those of the activists as a result of having watched the video, which is, well, this is not so surprising. This is people reaching to use the various defensive strategies and justifications, which were all included into this Dissonance.
Maybe because the woman was the person on the video. Maybe because of that.
Possibly. There's. I also interviewed many of the participants. This is a part of the key methodology process, and there was a lot of criticism of the female presenter. Also, because of the look, people said that they weren't going to take health advice from someone like that, for instance, which is valid. As far as I know, she has no medical training. Why should we take medical advice from her?
How big were the correlations if you calculated it only for the women?
Correlations between?
Between the groups and the activists. So if there is such a big difference in gender, I would imagine the calculations would change a lot. So
the distribution of males and females in each of the treatment groups were roughly the same. So this was not the factor that caused the impact. Do you not have the data here? So we see this is the correlation with the activists, almost 0.5 for those who watched the video and just over 2 for those who didn't. Anyway, this is a striking finding. Rothschild says that females tend towards the indirect strategies of avoiding dissonance, which are avoidance and dissociation. These, as in, they try and stay away from the topic, essentially. This is the typical female strategy. Whereas males tend towards more direct justifications. It's natural, it's necessary, etc. This is, so we've already found out there's this gender difference in this respect. And this perhaps can explain these findings as well. The females would prefer to avoid the advocacy situation altogether, but perhaps once they're in the advocacy situation, they're quite open to persuasion. Whereas males don't tend to avoid the situation so much, but they have likely already developed a whole range of different justifications which they use in these active justification approaches. This potentially explains some of the difference there. Some more interesting things. I also asked a whole bunch of other scales, including probing the level of knowledge about the industry. To do this, I gave each individual 8 pictures of different production processes involving chickens. Each one had a little description of it underneath. I asked all of my participants to mark each of the pictures which were legal in the EU. I asked them which practices can be certified as organic, which is free range, and I asked which are the dominant industry practices in Europe. So the way I marked it, if you answered I don't know, which was an option, you got 0 marks to that question. Every correct answer got a +1 point. Every incorrect answer got a negative, you got 1 point subtracted, under the sort of premise that it's better to know that you don't know than it is to think you know but have it wrong. Where do you think the activists scored on this scale?
Correct.
They're better than I don't know. They came in at, and this is the average, at 11.95, which is not a high level of knowledge. Yeah, on the range of I don't know to or correct, it's rather low. This is understandable once you've determined that all subjugation of animals is wrong. It's not surprising that you don't have a whole lot of interest for the particular production processes. I don't personally, you know. What about the students? Where do they come in?
-25.
They are on the negative side. They got more answers wrong than they got right, even when they had an I don't know option that they could use. So what do we see here? Level of knowledge is really, really low. Certainly among these students, I should point out their knowledge of health aspects was actually quite good. Their knowledge of environmental aspects was also quite good. It really seems to be on the industry side of things that we have the biggest knowledge gap, and it's definitely an ongoing project for vegan activism to address this. We know the industry is not providing this information, so this is really down to us.
Sorry, so this doesn't necessarily show you how much misinformation someone has as opposed to just lack of knowledge, does it?
Somewhat it's shown their misinformation, because if they get a negative point for each wrong answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
they could have answered I don't know for everything.
Right.
Show lack of knowledge as opposed to.
If everyone had answered I don't know for everything, they would have done better than they actually did. So this is a bit of an issue here, that activist knowledge is also quite low, because yeah, it might not from an animal rights point of view, these things might really be quite irrelevant to us. However, to these guys who certainly have a more welfareist view, these issues are absolutely paramount. And so if we're going to be the ones who are communicating this to them, we should probably have a little bit of better knowledge on these topics ourselves. Why else is this important? Well, what I found was that knowledge levels are inversely correlated with consumption levels of meat and dairy. That is, the more people know about the industry, the less they consume. So this should give us even more motivation to seek to address this knowledge gap and increase people's knowledge about production processes.
It's only students.
These are yeah.
Correlations are for students only, not the activists included.
That's right. That's right. Okay. One more thing. With a whole bunch of other scales, I tried to investigate carnism a little bit more deeply. What I found out was that speciesist attitudes, or unfavorable ethical judgments towards animals, were positively related to anthropocentrism. That is, people who see humans as being the center of the world and everything rotating around humans are likely to have less ethical judgments towards animals. I found it positively related to conservative socio-political views. That is, more conservative people are likely to have less favorable views towards animals. I found it, I developed a scale which measured people's tolerance for discrimination. They should say how ethically problematic they found a whole lot of different scenarios I presented to them, depicting some kind of discriminatory behavior, be it positive or negative, towards various human groups. What I found is that the more tolerant people were of discrimination among human groups, the more negative their ethical judgments were towards animals. Finally, and predictably, ethical judgments towards animals were related to consumption levels. Unfavorable ethical judgments. So this is quite predictable. So when I do a factor analysis here, and the goal here was to understand, essentially people are answering these different questions in similar ways. People who answer conservative to this question are likely to answer anthropocentric to this question, more tolerant for discrimination here. So there's a pattern among the responses. And the goal of the factor analysis was to determine what is the underlying construct which causes people to answer in these similar sort of patterns. When I took off the behavioral one and I did a factor analysis of the 4 psychographic scales, and what this revealed was a single factor, a single latent construct, which seemed to relate to the endorsement of dominance and hierarchical power structures. This is consistent with the Carnist domination dimension of the Carnist worldview, and I raise a question to finish with: does this constitute an argument for intersectional activism? It seems that all these different oppressions are all driven by a single underlying construct, which is the acceptance of hierarchy within our societies. So, is this an argument for working together with other marginalised groups? Perhaps. That's all for me today.